Hello, everyone. My name is Anna. I'm with the U Chicago Spiritual Life Office, and we are in charge of making sure that everyone on campus is able to live their best spiritual life in the best space of wellness that they can. And so this series, I Wonder As I Wander, is dedicated to helping young people who might be going through a time of spiritual change in their life. Perhaps they are out of their parents' house and they're independent for the first time ever. And that can be a really big change. It can come with a lot of doubt or shame or fear if there are any changes happening in their lives. And so we are going to be interviewing a bunch of people in the spiritual life community, asking them for some guidance on what young people can do to center themselves in knowledge and comfort along their spiritual journey. So today with me is Stacy Alan, the wonderful Stacy Alan. She runs Brent House here at U Chicago. Would you like to add a few details to that?
Yeah, so Brent House, I think we probably have the longest name of any of the religious groups on campus. We are Brent House, the Episcopal Center at the University of Chicago. Um, we have a house on Woodlawn when we are not in the middle of a pandemic, where we offer weekly Sunday services, programming during the week, a place of refuge for folks, just trying to make a place that's neither uh, housing nor the reg, nor a place where you have to pay to get your coffee. Um, we also have a residential community of graduate students who span religious traditions, who live in a kind of modified intentional community in the house. And we do a lot of ecumenical programming with other Christian groups and a lot of interfaith programming with my religious colleagues across campus.
Wonderful. Thank you for that detailed introduction. I think I even didn't know about the interfaith aspects of Brent House, so keep that in my noggin. So without further ado, you did mention in Brent House's name that it is an Episcopalian organization. So to perhaps kind of acquaint ourselves with what Episcopalianism is, it's a long word, right? What exactly are kind of the key tenets, doctrines, beliefs, and values of Episcopalianism or Christianity more broadly?
Right. So just to put us as Episcopalians in the broader Christian context, we have our roots in the Church of England. Those of you who are fans of Hamilton, our first American bishop is not portrayed terribly well. That was Samuel Seabury. We were the first breakaway church from the Church of England when the United States became independent. Those who were Anglicans needed to figure out who we were as Americans, and so we had to figure out what that identity was. For those who are familiar with the Protestant Catholic divide in Western Christianity, we sort of proudly stand straddling both. Our worship life and a lot of our traditions will feel very familiar to Roman Catholic folks or folks who know about Roman Catholicism. We usually default to having a Mass every week with communion or Eucharist. We have priests, people like me, and bishops and deacons, and so a kind of hierarchical structure to our clergy. On the other hand, from Protestantism, we get a deep love of Scripture and a passion for making sure that our prayers and Scripture are in the hands of all people of the church. And in the American church, we are governed by all of the church. So lay people have a strong voice in the church. That is, people who are not ordained. Lay people have a voice in electing a bishop. In fact, two of our Brent House students this last fall cast votes to elect our incoming bishop, the Reverend Paula Clark, our first African American and first woman bishop in the Diocese of Chicago. She's not the first in the Episcopal Church. Yeah, it was very exciting. We all cried, tears of joy. It was great. So we do this kind of straddling. We talk about the via media, which is funny with you as a Buddhist. You know, Buddhism also talks about the middle way, and there's a lot of this kind of both and that we will do. We are hierarchical and congregational. We are Protestant and Catholic. It frustrates my husband when I say that we're both. He's like, you have to choose. He also happens to be a Buddhist. He should know about the middle way. But we are fundamentally Christian. I mean, that is absolutely, you know, that's the Episcopalian is the dialect of Christianity that we speak, you can say. And so foundational to us as Christians is it's going to be Jesus, right? That's you can't be Christian without Jesus. So we always look to the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth as both our foundation, our inspiration, our guide, and even God, right? That there is the understanding in Christianity that Jesus was both human and divine, and that when we talk about God, we talk about this concept of God, which makes our other monotheist siblings really antsy when we talk about the Trinity of one God, but three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and whole libraries are dedicated to what that could mean. So as Christians, those are foundational. And within the Episcopal Church, our understanding of Jesus and his ministry has to do with what Jesus taught. That's one place where we start. And he taught God's absolute love for all. He taught that there is always, well, that God is surprising and shows up in the places where we often least expect God to show up, that no one is excluded from that love. And then through his death and resurrection, that's a whole nother, that would be a whole nother conversation to talk about what those mean. But in the shortest sense, that Jesus's death and resurrection are the means by which everything can be redeemed. So nothing is lost. The way that God does not let death be the last word in Jesus's life means that nothing is the last word for any of us. That would be the shortest.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, and I love that you noted love, and how important that is. Just because, a little fun fact for those watching or listening, I grew up in an interfaith household. So my father was Buddhist and my mother was Episcopalian. I ended up being Buddhist, but I went to what we called godly play when I was little. And I Wonder As I Wander was actually something that I encountered in godly play. I think it's a book and it's a song. And so that was such a radical feeling of just love for me in my spiritual journey wherever I go. That was impressed upon me at a young age in the church. So even though I did wonder and I did wander, and now I'm not an Episcopalian anymore, I still kind of culturally associate with it, just because it's something so rooted in inclusion and love. So,
well, and I love that you mentioned godly play. Godly play is a Sunday school. I think it's more than a curriculum. It's a whole model for teaching children within the church, and it's rooted in Montessori principles. And so that phrase, "I wonder," the teachers in the program are taught that when a child asks a question, you don't give the answer, and you don't say, "I don't know." You say, "I wonder." And the program is based on presenting these stories to kids with figurines, so you sort of act them out like a little, play set, and then the children are given the basic story, and then they get to play. And I wish that more people understood that our faith journey is about a kind of sacred play, and play in the most serious sense, right? Because it is a life and death thing, not heaven and hell, but as in, like, what do we value and who do we value and what are we willing to stand up for and what are our values? Well, the way that human beings learn things is through play. And so even as things that are spiritual can be of utmost importance, to make space for us to experiment and play and wonder, uh, that's why I do this. I mean, that we don't have a God that doesn't, that same God that made us and wired us to play is the one that's accompanying us. And so of course we can play. Of course there's a God who says, yeah, you can wonder, you can ask questions, you can experiment and see what happens. Here are the basic stories. What are you gonna do with them?
Right. There's so much inspiration in that. And I think that fits so snugly into the next question I was going to ask is about exploration of the Episcopalian Church, or Christianity at large, if you have thoughts on that. Would you say that godly play is a good way to approach perhaps someone that doesn't come from the Episcopalian tradition, but is kind of thinking, Stacy Alan is a really nice lady and I want to go to her church or what have you. That can be daunting for some people. How would you recommend they approach it?
Absolutely. Oh, it's so hard because I feel like I have to answer on two levels. One is like non-pandemic and one is pandemic.
Oh,
Because
right.
in non-pandemic, I would say just come to our house and we'll give you tea and we can talk. Or you could come to a service and sit in the back row and just observe. Or come to an event when we have a speaker and ask some questions or listen to other people's questions. So normally that's what we would do. We have a long history of, I like to think of us as being unapologetically Christian, unapologetically Episcopalian, and we're curious about who you are, right? So we have a long history of having folks as part of our community who are not Christians, who are not Episcopalians, who find within the Episcopal tradition and with the students who gather. I mean, I may be a nice lady, but it's really the students of the community that make us who we are. From day one, when I first got here, it was really clear that the students wanted us to be really rooted in our Christian tradition, in the Anglican tradition, but that the other non-negotiable is that all are welcome. And so we've had Jews and atheists and pagans, and I've had one Jedi realist who's been part of the community over the years. And so we simply say, here's our story. Here's how we understand it. Here are the various ways that you can participate, because there's no one way. Even if you were to come to a Sunday service, as I say, you can just stay in your seat and just sit and listen. You can say the words or not. You can choose to participate in our sacramental life, communion or not. And I try to explain along the way what we're doing and how we understand it and how people might make those decisions. So that's, because we're doing this work on a college campus, everybody's in a time of transition of some sort or another, right?
Right.
Folks are coming from high school into college, folks are coming from undergrad into graduate school. Those are inherently times when things are in flux. And so we are a space where we say, yeah, you're in flux. I have folks who have come in as lifelong Episcopalians who have left as atheists. There are those who've come in as Presbyterians who've become Episcopalians, folks who grew up with no religious background who've become Roman Catholic, folks who came in as atheist Jews who left as believing Jews. My job is to help you at this point discern, that's a big word for me, to discern what is the path that is going to make you Oh, this phrase sounds so hippy dippy, but to make you the best you that you could be, right? That there is a vision. My belief is that God created you and delights in this Anna that's in front of me, and
Mm-hmm.
that there's a dream of this fully realized Anna that is out there. It's not a plan, it's not a template, it's not a mold, but it's an experiment that you and God work out together. And so for some people, that's going to be within our tradition, and that's great. For some people, it's not. And to the extent that the wisdom that we gather in our tradition is helpful to you, great. We have a lot of, particularly some of the Jews who have been active in our community. I have no intention of converting them, but our two traditions have a lot in common in that we love our books. Episcopalians love books. And we love kind of esoteric language.
Yeah.
And so there's some folks who like coming to our services just because they like the language, sort of older, weightier
Right.
English that is part of our tradition. So no, the point of who we are is to be with people who are in times of change and transition. And so our job is to support that and to encourage that and provide the resources of centuries and even millennia of human engagement with these questions.
Beautiful. Thank you. It definitely seems like such an inviting space. I think especially the emphasis on allowing people to transform within the church. I think there's a lot of fear for some that, you know, once they go in, they just need to stick to the rules and, you know, just be that. But it's so reassuring to hear, first of all, the diversity of people who are able to explore, but then also the different transformations that they're allowed to go through, kind of the godly play that they're allowed to go through as they're experiencing it in the Episcopalian Church. Speaking
And I
of,
will include,
sure.
that the transitions that folks go through within our community are not always just religious, right? We've had folks come in who are discerning sexual identity, they're discerning gender identity, and we've accompanied, there are folks I've accompanied through a couple different sets of pronouns over the course of their time with us, because that is, I wish we were more allowed to play with those things. We get so caught up in getting that somehow right.
Yeah.
Our relationships and career choices, majors, figuring out what you value, thinking about me, thinking about politics, all of those things are also part of those transitions that people are in the middle of. And while some of those don't have explicitly religious language, I believe that the religious traditions can provide lenses and guidance for how we think about those other questions as well.
For sure. And community certainly helps as well.
Absolutely.
I think both of those elements, you know, having a space where first of all you feel safe to go through those transitions, but then also the people there going through them with you and cherishing you through those transitions it means everything. And kind of speaking of just the nature of transition in and of itself, those are often very scary and kind of inwardly tumultuous times. Not that they need to be, but you know, as human beings, sometimes we get a little nervous about change. You know, we really, really like things to stay stable, and when they're not, it can feel chaotic. It can feel anxiety-inducing. For any form of transformation, whether it's spiritual or, like you were saying, any kind of identity transformation, for people who are feeling ashamed or afraid of kind of what comes next or losing what they currently have, what advice would you have, especially for young people who haven't gone through a ton of changes yet in their life, who might be experiencing that for the first time?
Oh, there's so much. So I'm gonna pull back a little bit because I think there's a bigger picture that we can hold up. One of the things that I've realized, particularly with undergraduates in the last several years, you know, with the changes in the application process and with, you know, the rise in standings and all of those things that have happened, I'm finding more and more that I hear from the undergrads a profound, and this happens with the graduate students as well, but a profound discomfort with failure.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
nobody likes to fail. Nobody like, no, I hate failing. I hate it. I hate it. But we all do. And I have stories that I could tell of epic fails in my life that I've had to figure out how to come back from. And failure is a kind of transition. And learning, and this is why I for me, in the Christian tradition, we begin always with the fact that you are beloved and that will never, ever change. Because it is from that point that I can engage with my failure. I can say, this failure sucks. This failure is humiliating. This failure is hard. This failure is confusing. This failure makes me rethink everything. But it will not fundamentally change my worth or my value as a beloved child of God. There's another kind of transition that I want to make sure I talk about, because I think in the Episcopal Church there can be a perception that we don't talk about sin. And sin is a fraught concept. I want to be really careful with it. Sin is not first and foremost about rules that you break. It's not first and foremost about sex. There's so many more creative ways that we can sin than just, you know, whatever sexual thing people decide is the sin of the day. But that sin is when we make choices that violate who we are or who others are. Sin is a way, and so sin can appear really minor, but can have internal and external consequences in how we live in the world that are going to really warp our ability to be fully the beloved child of God that we are, or to honor fully the beloved child of God that is in front of us. And so one of the things that I want to make sure that people know, and I'm going to try not to use the language, but I often will talk about sin as screwing up, except I use a different word that begins with F. Because everybody knows what that means, right?
Right.
When you screw up, you have made a choice, and it's gone really wrong, and you can't fix it, and you can't take it back, right? And it's an awful place to be when you realize that.
Right.
And the thing that so many Christians seem to forget is that's the point. We keep saying that's the point, that we all have done that. We all, there's, you know, to quote scripture, we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And the good news of Christianity is that's not the end, right? What I said at the beginning, everything can be redeemed. And so another kind of transition is to be able to stand in my belovedness and turn with some courage, maybe holding God's hand, and say, I did this. Right. I can't fix it. Now what? But that honesty to be able to turn it, it's what we need to do as a whole nation, is to be able to turn and look at our national sins, and that's a whole other story. But individually as well, to be able to say, okay, I screwed up. I sinned. Now what? And God will say, yeah, you did. That was not good. Don't do that again, please.
Let this be.
And then God will say, I love you. Let's look at reconciliation. Let's look at repentance. Let's look at, there's a great Episcopal phrase, amendment of life. Right? And it doesn't depend entirely on my pulling myself up from my bootstraps. It's a kind of surrender to say, I did this and I can't fix it. So that's another kind of transition. And then there are those more general transitions of, I have come to college, what the traditions that my parents raised me in are starting to feel not quite right, and I need to figure out whether that is still who I am. I am experimenting with different kinds of friendships, and some of those work and some of those don't. I am figuring out what kind of political stances I have, or cultural engagement I have, or just those hard to pin down questions of who am I? All of those kinds of transitions. Now, the trick, I think, is, wow, this just occurred to me. I think among those three kinds of transition that I talk about, sometimes we confuse them. And so sometimes we'll say that failure means that I have sinned. Now, they can kind of overlap, but learning to tease apart that failure sometimes is just failure. You know, I didn't get that internship because there were other people that were perceived to be a better fit, right? Or that relationship ended, maybe not because I did something wrong, but because the other person needed to mature some more, right? Or, you know, a failure has happened and maybe I need to look and see how I was complicit in that happening and what my responsibility is. And then, you know, if I'm feeling really uncomfortable with what I assumed my sexual orientation was, and that's not, and you know, I broke up with my boyfriend because that just didn't feel right. Now I'm thinking about girls. Or now I'm feeling much more drawn to, you know, genderqueer folks. Some people will understand that as a sinful thing or as a failure, but it's a normal transition. So I think a lot of the work for folks in these years of their life can be not just being in the traditions, but transitions, but figuring out what transition you're in the middle of. So that you can dedicate your energy to repentance and amendment of life, or figuring out who I am in the face of my failure, or figuring out where I need to move to in this transition. I think that's there's a lot going on.
Yeah, well, and it reminded me when you were talking about how especially sin and failure get conflated. I was thinking back to your definition of sin, when you're interfering with who you are or who someone else is. I mean, sometimes failure is exactly what we need to remind us of who we are, right?
Oh yeah.
It's so necessary to, I think, at least for me, wake me up and make me realize, you know what, I think I need to be doing something else here. Not because I can't deal with more failure, but because I'm realizing through this transition that perhaps there's a different path for me.
Yeah.
But I didn't mean to interrupt you if you had other thoughts.
No. Though I do tend to think aloud, and so I am intrigued by this thing that just occurred to me of how we tease apart those different kinds of transitions, because I'm realizing that is where where some unnecessary pain comes in, when we have mixed up what is the transition that I'm in.
Absolutely. Well, and there's so many measures to take in stride, you know, as you're transitioning, because at the end of the day, it's hard to determine those absolutes. I for sure have sinned. I for sure have failed. I for sure am changing. You know, in Buddhist thought, there's this belief that all that we really know is this current moment. There's no way to really determine whether or not you've changed, because every single moment that Anna from 1 second ago is gone. Now I'm this Anna. That it's impossible to measure up to all of these expectations, for one thing, that society puts on us, about what success or failure is, about what sin and sacred nature are. Right, we just got to wonder as we wander.
Yeah, and try not to do it alone.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit. I think I just prodded a little bit at critical theory. And on that note, I just wanted to inquire about where Episcopalianism and Christianity are seated in a lot of the modern debates on oppression and privilege. Just because I know that for a lot of young people, those things are so important right now. Just making sure that we understand the structures that we're living in, how to help people who truly need it, and become better people in the process of learning about those things.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I have to be. It is important to acknowledge that there are, as I say, I have co-religionists, right, fellow Christians, who would profoundly disagree with anything I'm about to say next. I know that the Southern Baptist Church is having some struggles because some members of the church, particularly Black members of the church, have talked about critical race theory and saying we need to look at systemic racism, and the structures of that church have said, no, we're not going to talk about it. And some folks are leaving because they won't engage with a systemic understanding of racism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is another thing where we could talk all day about it. So let me figure out where to start. So for those who would be familiar with this term, I was really formed both as an undergrad with the Jesuits and in my seminary days by liberation theologies, which really do begin with these systemic analyses of the context, right? That Christian life does not happen in a vacuum or in the abstract, but it happens in a very concrete place and time with real people with bodies and histories, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is a big one of the fundamental moments of Christianity or understandings of Christianity is this idea of incarnation, so that God became human. And the scandalous part of that is that God became human in a specific place and time, not in all places and times. Sort of. That can be. We could talk about that, but in terms of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Like, why not? You know, I'm trying to think of Joe from Poughkeepsie in 1789, right? Why there and then, right? But that is what we believe, that it was a person in a particular historical moment,
Mm-hmm.
and that God chose to be there in that particular way. So this idea of incarnation, the idea of God having a body that is mutable, that is mortal, that is limited and finite, that's kind of scandalous.
Mm-hmm.
But from that point, then I think it makes all kinds of sense to say that our faith in these millennia since then, that Christian faith always has to be incarnate. Christian faith always has to be connected to its context. The other thing that I think is that Christians often forget about is that Jesus was Jewish. Jesus was not a Christian, right? And he was formed by his identity as a Jew. And one of the great gifts I think that the Jewish tradition has given us is an understanding that that sin is not simply an individual thing. Individuals can sin, but there are systems of sin. If you look at the Hebrew prophets, many of them will talk about things like, for them it was mostly about a lot about money, that systems of debt, and that there is an understanding that if someone has lots and lots of wealth, the reason they have that is because others don't have enough. And so Jesus would have gotten this understanding uh, of systemic systems of sin as part of who he was. And so we can carry that into our understanding as Christians. So there's all kinds of things there. I think the thing that I want to maybe to focus on, and it's not the only systemic sin. I mean, we've got misogyny and homophobia as a homophobia, you know, just destruction of the natural environment and ableism and all sorts of things. But I do think that for Americans, we always have to go back to racism because and this is I'm going to use a loaded term, but I use it very intentionally, that racism is our original sin. And original sin is one of those concepts that's been used to beat people up and make people feel unworthy and unsavable and all of those things. But I think one way of understanding original sin is that it is those structures that we are embedded in, from which we can never leave them, right? We're always in a context. That they're those structures around us that make it almost impossible not to sin within that context, right? So that I'm super white, right? I don't can. I was raised, I've got, you know, by folks of Scandinavian descent in the Midwest, you know, it's about as white as you can get. And learning what that means, not just as the default, but as an actual, you know, what does it mean to be white, as opposed to just assuming it as, you know, something we don't think about. That we need to pay attention to the fact that our right inherent in the very roots, the very foundation of our common identity in this country is slavery, right? And the racism that justified slavery. And I think that what we can do as Christians is say, yes, we understand that there are systemic aspects to sin, that they are systems that we always have to be examining, always have to be challenging. There's a little edge of some of it we can't just fix. It's a little tricky here because it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be working within actual systems of politics and culture and church and whatever else that we're dealing with. We always need to be looking and working with others to make those things better. But there is, I think, to me, it's strangely hopeful to say that when we talk about original sin, that if it were just about a fix, a tweak, that it would make it all better. If it was just better education, if it was just better therapy, if it was just better social systems, that we could just fix it. It doesn't get at how deep and intractable what we are up against is. And for me as a Christian, what gives me hope is, again, that Jesus with his death and resurrection shows us that everything can be redeemed. And redemption is not fixing. Redemption is much more profound. It's about healing and reconciliation and transformation, right? It's a deep, deep process. And so when I can say it's not all on me to fix it, but I can't not participate, I can't not dedicate myself to working toward that, it kind of gives me a strange freedom to say, oh shoot, there's a quote from a rabbi about this. Something along the lines of, you know, you will not complete the work, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't give everything to doing the work. I can't remember exactly what it is. So, and it's why I think it's so important for us to have this concept of sin within the church, because it gives us a way of saying, oh yeah, that's wrong. That has gone wrong. Here's a tool for me to think about my complicity in it. One of the things I think in the Episcopal Church, we're still trying to figure out how to articulate. I think it's there, but we haven't done a terribly good job of it, is not just for people like me who are white, if we're talking about racism, but also for people of color, how can we offer comfort and support and affirmation and spaces to be and thrive, even as us white folks are being like, yeah, we gotta work on this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a balancing act, I think, that we as a whole culture are doing, and it certainly is happening in the church, of how to make a space where everyone can both honestly and healthfully think about their complicity and their responsibility in structures of sin, and how can those who have been violated
Mm-hmm.
and oppressed by those systems also find a space of freedom and life and thriving and healing? Can that happen in the same Christian community? And I would think, and it occurs to me that we have reason to believe that can, because in the earliest days of the church, you had a really interesting mix of folks. I mean, they accused Jesus of hanging out with tax collectors and prostitutes, but also there were women of means who provided the first spaces of hospitality for Jesus and his disciples, Mary and Martha being two of them. And in the early church, even, as the church was spreading, it often was women of means who would provide that space where slaves and artisans and soldiers and, others would gather. So the earliest days of the church had that place of people who usually did not mix,
Yeah.
being in one community. I think that was both the draw and the challenge of the early church. Was it messed with the understanding of who got to hang out with whom,
Mm-hmm.
and what value each member of that community had. So if we can look to that, I think we as Christians, within the broader movements of justice within our culture, can participate and provide some resources for that work.
Right. Well, and I appreciate the thoughts that you shared on what seems to be this sustainable method of activism, where I know so many people. My current partner is Black, so there were a lot of emotional roller coasters that I was going through when George Floyd passed away. I'm also a Minnesotan, so we were 30 minutes away from everything that was going on. Quarantining with my family, it was a very, very fraught time, just spatially, existentially, everything. And I had friends who were calling me just panicking because it was Minnesota. like you, my mom is very white.
Minnesota nice.
It's yes, well, and Minnesota nice. I think that what's happened over the past year has been a major check on that behavior of Minnesota nice, and anything like it, because there is this sense of performativity, right? There is this sense of I don't feel comfortable right now, and I really need this to I need to feel like I've done the right thing in this situation and move on. It's a culture of that.
Right.
And so
Right.
that's exactly what people were thrown into panic about, is because you can't fix George Floyd. You can't single-handedly fix the entire earth from complete destruction from greenhouse gases, right? And the main advice that I had for so many of my friends that were calling me, not that having a partner who's Black absolves me of anything. I've learned so much over the past year, but the main thing that I said is, we need to be in this for the long game. Just imagine, if you can take stock of all of the terrible things that are happening right now. We're in a pandemic. There's so much going on with racial relations right now. There's so much going on with taking care of the earth right now. if we need to run this marathon until, you know, the day that we die, we got to eat a lot of protein. We got to drink a lot of water, get our stretches in, and make sure that we can do that, you know?
Yeah. No,
Um,
preach it, preach it. This is
right.
exactly what I've been thinking about for years.
Right. Because if you just sprint 10 meters, your job isn't done. You know, good for you that you've won that 10-meter race. But this is not a short distance race. This is literally an existential marathon. It's exhausting. You're gonna need to take breaks every once in a while, but you just really can't allow yourself to slip into the the Minnesota nice. I'm uncomfortable and I just need this to be done. I need to stop thinking about it and move on.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, there are two things that occur to me. One is that's why, you know, part of my work here in working with students is to help discern what is going to be sustainable for the long haul, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, that's going to be a Buddhist path, because the disciplines of meditation, the way that death is part of. My husband is Buddhist, and so he talks about the death meditations, right? Where
Right.
you go deep into some really uncomfortable stuff as a way of putting yourself into context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both telling the truth about who you are and what will eventually happen to you,
Mm-hmm.
so that it doesn't have power over you, right? So the Buddhist path for some people is that is what makes it sustainable. You know, if it's paganism, which often, not always, has a really is really tied to the earth and the cycles of the seasons, if that's what makes it sustainable for you, fabulous, fabulous. Let's figure out how that works for you and find you a community to do that in.
Mm-hmm.
I think for Christianity, you know, it occurs to me that part of what can be the gift of Christianity is that we have, just talking to somebody about the tricky balance between the crucifixion and the resurrection, that particularly white American Protestants really love the resurrection, right? Because that's where it's all fixed, right? That's where everything's just been
He's
fixed.
back.
But that's an incredibly shallow understanding of the resurrection, and it
Mm-hmm.
loses its power, I think, when we think about it that way. We have to hold both, because here you have and what I think Christians need to recover, is that Jesus's death was not a neutral death, right?
Oh.
Jesus didn't get the flu. He wasn't pushed off a cliff, you know. He and he wasn't. It wasn't even that he was stoned to death. He was crucified, and crucifixion was only the Romans crucified people. The Jewish
Mm-hmm.
state establishment did not crucify people. And the only two groups of people who were crucified were slaves and subversives.
Wow.
So, in order for Jesus to be crucified, however you understand who he was and what he did, someone among the Romans perceived that he was a danger to the status quo, he was a danger to the state. And crucifixion was a way of raising that up as an example. And so we absolutely have to sit with the profound discomfort of looking at, I was just talking about, there's some Christian practices of meditating on the cross. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that. But I'm just finishing, it took me too long to get to this book, James Cohen's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree,
Mm-hmm.
where he talks about how, you know, perhaps as white American Christians, we need to think about Jesus lynched as opposed to Jesus on the cross,
Right.
because there's a really similar dynamic in who got lynched, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lynching was meant to keep people in their place, to remind them not to step out of line. It was a form of terrorism, right? You saw that, and you knew that you had to back down.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to have that to hold on to, and we need to have the resurrection. I spent some formative years in Central America where people spent a lot of time with the cross, for very good reason. You have centuries of oppression and torture and marginalization and all of those things. And so the cross provides some comfort because there's a place where people can say, God understands what I'm going through because this is what God went through.
Mm-hmm.
But then the problem with that is then it can fall into a kind of fatalism if you don't have the resurrection,
right,
to balance it out. And so when we can move from the cross into the resurrection, one of the pieces of the resurrection story, to me, that is so profound, is that when Jesus, in the resurrection, when he appears to his disciples, and we always talk about doubting Thomas, right? In Jesus, Thomas doubts that the resurrection happens. So Jesus shows up and says, "Here I am, Thomas." and the way that he shows Thomas that it's really him is by showing him his wounds.
mm-hmm.
Right? He literally says, "You can put your finger in my wounds,"
Mm-hmm.
which means that this isn't about fixing. If this were a superficial story about fixing, then Jesus would be perfect. He'd be buff, he'd be tan, he'd be, whatever, walking into the room, his hair would be nice, it'd be all those things. That would be the fix. That's the fantasy. And to me, that's part of why I feel that there's some really deep wisdom in this story, because Jesus is able to bring his suffering and his wounds through the tomb into the resurrection. And his resurrected body bears the wounds, right? That's that redemption, that nothing is without redemption. Nothing cannot be brought into the new life. And so that for me, as a Christian, the sustainability part is I have, at the most basic level, those two resources. I have a place for the suffering and I have a place for the hope. And, depending on the day, I'm going to lean into one or the other,
Mm-hmm.
or I'll be straddling both because that's where life is.
Okay.
And that's that sustainable thing. But I think for anyone discerning what their spiritual path is, I think even for those who identify as atheists,
Mm-hmm.
I have deep respect for folks who discern that their spiritual path, it's sort of an oxymoron, is as some form of secular humanism or atheism or agnosticism. There's a kind of courage to that, and it requires figuring out what is it that makes it sustainable for you, right? And I can't speak from within that because that's not me, but what I see in the folks who do that well, and to do that in a way that is sustainable, is they find those materials. It's in community, it's in art, it's in good stories, it's in good theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's in good systemic understandings of the world. It's in science. And so really, I think your point, that's exactly what I think about all the time, is how do we give people the resources to make this sustainable for the long haul, so that all of you who are learning computer science or biology or political science or history or whatever, can take what you're learning and put it to work for the good of all of us in whatever little niche you're in, because no one of us is able to do it all. And so if we can trust that there's both, I'm able to do my work for the long haul, and I can trust that other people are doing their work for the long haul, and we're talking together about it, we're going to be great. It's going to be good, right? But if we spread ourselves too thin by trying to do all the things, we're gonna fail, which is why failure is good, because you cannot do all the things, so you should fail at it. And in that failure, discerning what then I need to do to focus on. And if we try to do it alone, those two temptations I think are related, because if we do it alone, we don't know if anybody's doing it, so we think we have to do all the things.
Right.
And we need to rest. This is another bit of wisdom we get from the Jewish tradition, right? 6 days of work, a day of rest. We need celebration. We need recreation, that wonderful word, which, you know, we are recreating ourselves by playing, again, that word, by celebrating, by being in our bodies, or by being in other parts of our brain. That's absolutely part of it. I just finished reading a book called Pleasure Activism by Adrienne Maree Brown. She is definitely not a Christian, but it was a delightful exploration. It's a kind of an eclectic collection of essays and poems and interviews of thinking about, again, how do we make this sustainable, and what are the spiritual and emotional and physical practices that we can engage in, so that in the midst of the suffering, in the midst of the frustration, in the midst of even the despair and the lament, we have moments of joy. Because like you said, in that sort of Buddhist mode, we still have to be here now. And if I put in oh man, you got me going. You know, there's a perverted form of Christianity that said that, you know, the line, this was told to the slaves too, that, you know, you can have pie in the sky when you die, therefore you put up with your suffering now. I think we can translate that too in terms of social justice work. Well, I can rest once we achieve, you know, bail reform, or once we achieve, you know, a stop to global warming, then I can rest. Problems are too big for that. So we have to be able to say, in the midst of the work, and we do need to work really hard, and there will be times when we get really, really tired and we got to keep going. Anyone who's been a parent knows that that's what you have to do. But in the midst of that, to find the joy, in the midst of that, to celebrate the relationships, in the midst of that, to say that my body is good and holy and deserves, you know, a run along the lake, or a nice piece of chocolate, or a snuggle with the person I love the most on the couch, right? Those moments are worth it on their own, and without them, we can't do the work for the long haul, not in a healthy way.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and I
Oh,
think
you got me so excited.
it's an exciting conversation. Well, and perhaps to kind of tie the bow around this question, like as to put this as explicitly as possible, because we've come back to this so often, like you need to do this in pluralism, right? You cannot do this alone. And not only will the pluralism, by pluralism, I mean like being with a diversity of people and working together toward one goal, appreciating each other's presence in that work. For one thing, is going to help you reach that goal. And for another, is going to bring that joy and that affirmation into the work itself. You dream together, like being able to dream with other people rather than, you know, sitting with yourself and just feeling like, I just wish something was like this, but I just don't know how it's achievable. I think the more that I dream with others, I realize how achievable it is. When you have that strength in numbers, when you have those dreams in numbers, it's so much more doable and so much more enjoyable. But
yeah, and there's a particular challenge to that. This idea of plurality, and this is a tricky thing for some of what we inherit in the Christian tradition. So, you know, actually, I think we just prayed a prayer this morning at morning prayer that was one of these. There is a kind of exclusivist claim in Christianity, right? That there is no other moment in history where God became human. We say that. It makes me uncomfortable to say that in this context because, you know, there's baggage. But we do say that. Muslims say, you know, Muhammad was the last and best prophet. You know, for Muslims, Jesus was a prophet. He wasn't quite as good as Muhammad, right? There are you know, my husband and I will talk about the some of the irreconcilable elements between a Christian cosmology and a Buddhist cosmology.
Mm,
You know, there are things that overlap in some really interesting and surprising ways.
absolutely.
Uh, but inherently, you can't reconcile the Christian sense of a singular and unique soul in a body that
Mhm,
dies and you're done with reincarnation in Buddhism. They
mhm,
just, you can't. So how do we, I think, and this is what I have learned from our students. This wasn't this has been one of the great gifts I've received in my time here is I think, you know, I've been here 16 years, and since then, what I see in the young adults that come through Brent House is a comfort with saying, this is who I am,
mm.
and going deep into that. So I can say without apology, I love Jesus. I do. I do. Um, there, yeah, Jesus is my Lord and Savior. I can say that, and I don't
Mhm,
apologize for it. And I can affirm both you and my husband in saying, you know, the path of the Buddha uh, is leading me toward enlightenment in a way that I cannot reconcile with Jesus as my
mhm,
Lord and Savior, and I need to be okay with both of those. Sorry, there's a
mhm.
coffee grinder in the background. Um, and I think there is a way that can hold these pluralities of truth.
Mhm.
I can't explain exactly the mechanism. I just know that I've experienced it, that we can sit with that. We can find the places of commonality. We can find our common goals. We can find the common values and allow people to, to enact them from within those irreconcilable cosmologies.
Mhm.
Um, Again, I think it comes back to play. If we
Yeah.
understand that God or the fundamental reality or truth of the universe is something that it can encompass a universe,
Mhm.
then any of our particular narratives, any of our particular faith structures, we cannot express them all.
Mhm.
I'm gonna. I have a. One of my favorite ways to talk about religion is to use the metaphor of language.
Mhm.
That all languages will talk have words for water, mother. You know, that's probably the primal one. You know, and how many languages the word for mother has M's in it. You know,
Right.
mama. You know,
Uh-huh.
right? Or umma, or you know, there's all of these words, and there's this M sound that is about
Mhm.
mom, right?
Ah.
So there's some primal things. They all have words for happiness and the sun, and there's some profound things. But once you get into the language, you know, the vocabulary, the grammatic structure, idioms, which then leads to the kinds of jokes that you can tell, what can be described and what can't be described, uh, where poetry lies, what can you not say? You know,
Mhm.
like English, you can't use a double negative. Double negatives make no sense. But in Spanish, a double negative works as an emphasizer, right?
Mhm.
So, and I think that's how I understand religion. That
Mhm.
each religion is like a language, and there are things that all religions attempt to do, and
Mm.
all religions, the good ones, the helpful ones, uh, express them with truth and with a resonance to human experience. And
Absolutely.
we can communicate with each other, but we also have to allow each of those languages to have its own integrity
Mhm.
so that it can express it in its own particular way, uh, uh, um, the truth that it can say.
Right.
So there's, and so I think when we talk about plurality, it's about both allowing that multitude of languages to exist and to say,
Mhm.
what do we need to say to each other? What is the essential stuff that we have to say to each other? What are the things that we need to proclaim
Mhm.
together that are not negotiable, that we share together? And I think that is the turning point where we are, because we have, oh man, I could just go on and on. The thing that's haunting me right now, the thing that's haunting me right now is QAnon, right? Because as I've been reading about QAnon, I'm realizing that it's taking on the characteristics of religion.
Oh, absolutely.
And the ways that those who are involved in that particular set of lies,
Mm-hmm.
I hear them speak and I think, I have said that exact phrase.
Mm.
I have had to look at prophecies and say, well, Jesus said he was going to come back soon. That's what the early church thought, but he hasn't come back yet. How do I do that?
Mm-hmm.
There's stuff going on in QAnon that's almost that exact same kind of dynamic. How do I think about that? And how do I say QAnon is wrong? QAnon is evil. I think I can say that pretty assuredly, when so much of what is happening with it echoes things that I say and do, right? So that's where we need to start, in that plurality, start discerning for ourselves, who do we want to be together? What are the non-negotiable values in that? And that requires a kind of clarity of speech and a drawing of lines and boundaries that I don't think we have been comfortable with, because we also want to be inclusive. And inclusivity is great, except when those who want to be included are the ones who are going to undermine the health of the whole, through lies and through deceit and through all of the oppressions that are out there. So it's a very complicated process. And even as I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, well, but then there's this and then there's that. And how do we do this? And that, I think, is the work of these generations now, is how do we figure out who we want to be? What are the boundaries around that? Such that we can have, we can support the well-being of all, the thriving of all in the midst of that.
Absolutely. Well, and I think that, first of all, to emphasize the amount of process that it takes to enter into a pluralistic space is so important, because there is so much process involved, and those are the exact skills that allow us as human beings succeed together. You know, there's communication, which we're not doing so much of these days, but continuing to wonder and ask questions and affirm that these things that I think sound great and really hippy dippy when they're coming out of my mouth, but when we look around at our society these days, it's just not happening. It's just not happening. And I think part of it is, for one thing, losing stamina. You know, we're running this marathon, and I think some of us don't realize that that's the treadmill that we're on, but you get tired, and it's just kind of like, I don't know how to communicate. I don't know how to affirm. I don't know how to wonder right now. I don't know what to do. But at the end of the day, we close off, and those conversations stop happening. And I know it's one thing that I've really appreciated over the past few years, that is outside of my tradition, is something my mom is super excited about, is Bishop Curry's way of love. For those
we all love Bishop Curry. We all love Bishop Curry.
Bishop Curry is a wonderful person. For those who are watching or listening who are like, who the heck is Bishop Curry? Bishop Curry is the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church here in the United States. So structurally speaking, I know when I was little, my mom would say they're basically the president of the Episcopal Church in America.
Well, and the title is presiding bishop. So
right, exactly. They are presiding.
And those who have not, folks, he might have blipped on their radar because he preached at the royal wedding with Meghan and
Harry.
Great. Keep them all straight. Meghan and Harry's wedding, to some eyebrow raising among the upper crust of England, because He showed emotion.
The sermon is wonderful. Go watch this.
It's beautiful. Go find it. Bishop Curry. Oh my goodness. And he is one, and I'll let you actually point, but he is one who is able to hold the pain and the joy together. He released a message after the insurrection at the Capitol, where he it was about as fierce as I've ever seen him in a recorded sermon, about the murder of Black people, and being the one that we're focused on, but he just sort of represents multitudes, right? But he can't not just radiate joy, even as he's lifting up the suffering. So yeah, he does that so well. So you were talking about Michael Curry and his way of love.
Yes. So I encourage you all to honestly just Google Bishop Curry Way of Love and look at the images that pop up, and then Google Buddhism Eightfold Path, because that is exactly when my mom, we're both very bookish religious women, and so she was talking to me when it first developed about, oh, this way of love, I love it so much. And I looked at the picture that she showed me. I was like, that's the Dharma. In Buddhism, we have this system of just how do I say this, moral direction, to be deep about it, but kind of ethics to be most simplistic about it. And I just had such a deep sense of affirmation for my mother, because it is a difficult thing, living in a situation where we are so similar, but we disagree on something that is so important to us, which is our religion. But it's something that we still love, and we love sharing with each other. And to see such a synergy between our two traditions, her reverence for the way of love and my reverence for the Dharma. It was something that I think, again, kind of straddling both the different and the same. We don't want to live in a pluralism where we're saying, oh, like, I like you because that part of your tradition really reminds me of my tradition. That's not what it means to be pluralistic. It's to see someone as they are and deeply appreciate that part of them, not necessarily because they're the same as you, but exactly because they're different from you. And that was a moment where both of those things happened. I realized how synergistic our traditions were, but then also how inherently different. And the difference was something I could appreciate. It was something that I was able to learn about her for her reverence for this way of love. And I loved so much that she was an Episcopalian woman. It was a very inviting experience, kind of sharing that together.
Yeah. My husband and I had an interesting experience a few years ago. There's they call it a retreat, but there's a thing from Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, called the spiritual exercises. And one of the ways that you can do these exercises is through a 9-month directed series of prayers. And one of the features of this particular retreat is a very an imagination exercises in imagination in prayer. So you'll take a story from the Gospels, and in the context of your prayer, allow it to unfold in your imagination as if you were there. What do you smell? What's the temperature? Who's there? Who's talking? How are you involved? And who what is Jesus doing? Right? Very full of people and narrative and all those things. And while I was doing that, occasionally my husband would, and so you pray like for 45 minutes every day. It's a lot. Best thing I ever did, but it was a lot. And he would sometimes come and do his meditation with me in the same space.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting is we were both, if you looked at us from the outside, we were doing the same thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of in terms of category, it was the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, my prayer was full of voices and story and interpersonal interaction and, very, very personal. And for him, it was about stripping all of that away. It was about getting, that essential simplicity of a Buddhist meditation, right? Just the breath, just.
Mm-hmm.
So that it was interesting that what we struggled with in each of our times of prayer and meditation sometimes were the opposite things to achieve the good we were trying to get. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah.
And for both of us, it was a holy time. Both of us, I can tell you, in the years that I've known him, I have seen the Buddhism be a path to him being a better, stronger, healthier person. Absolutely. And hopefully my own path has done the same for me. I could not be a Buddhist. I need my prayer to be a dialogue. I need the person. That's just me. Right?
Yeah.
I need the stories. And that would not work for him. Absolutely is not his path. And I love that. I love it.
That kind of reminds me of I suppose I think the experiment that they did with the Buddhist monks where they were like trying to track like their brain waves and everything. And that just really speaks to I think what we've been talking about with transformation and kind of like you really need to go through your process, right? Because fitting yourself into a box that you don't belong in is going to make you unhappy, but it's also going to make you like it's going to make you someone that you're not, right? The religious journey is about becoming who you're meant to be, becoming your best self, all of these corny things. And I just think on when I think about that experiment and all of kind of the loving kindness meditation and what it was doing to those monks' brains, I think about all human brains and not necessarily about oh, well, if everyone did the loving kindness meditation, then everyone would feel the same way that these monks do. I know for a fact that meditation drives some people nuts. Instead, I'm thinking more in the sense there are people whose brains light up like this when they're hugging somebody. There are people whose brains light up like this. Stacy Alan's brain lights up like this when she's in prayer, right?
Or singing a hymn, right?
Or dance party in your kitchen.
Right? Walking out in the woods, looking at the mountains. Yeah.
Right. So I think that, again, we're coming back to this theme of just straddling like sameness and difference, straddling duality, so to speak, where we are so similar in the sense that we're able to feel this profound sense of joy. We're able to feel these profound feelings of sadness, but there are so many different ways to get there, and allowing ourselves to embark on those different paths, I think, is the first massive step. It's just a matter of allowing ourselves to do that, for sure. Yeah.
I cannot believe how long we've been talking. It feels like 20 minutes.
There's a lot to talk about. I think we have time for one more question. I want to try to prioritize perhaps what the most interesting one might be. I think perhaps we can talk a little bit about salvation and get a little controversial. So let me try to frame this in the most specific terms as possible. So we've been talking about oppression and privilege, right? And especially with American Christianity, sometimes there are situations in which people who are oppressed, for example, people who are living in poverty, people of color, members of the LGBTQ plus community, are susceptible to some forms of discrimination by Christians because their identities are perceived as speaking to their value in God's eyes. They're perceived as being sinful because of things that they can't control. We talked about systems before, right? So even though you, Stacy, and me, Anna, might be aware that these people are a product of certain systems, for race, it's literally just systems of genetics. I guess, how do we approach these very inflammatory debates about Christian salvation, in which some people are just not as able as others to be saved?
Mm-hmm.
It's a heavy question.
Yeah, so I think, to be fair, even to some of my more conservative co-religionists, I think pretty much all Christians would say everyone can be saved. Now, there's so much to unpack about, like, what does being saved mean, and what is the process by which that happens. So I would say that even those who believe that you must be a Christian in order to get into heaven, which is one model of salvation, they would say, well, anybody can make that choice. Anybody can take that step. I think that's kind of on the theoretical and theological level. In practice, what ends up happening, I think, particularly with LGBTQ plus folks, there is a bizarre, and it's not essential to Christianity, but it's gotten tacked on so strongly that it can feel essential, a bizarre obsession with genitals and what you do with them, as if that is really, I mean, that's something that Jesus never talked about. Jesus did say something about divorce, which the practice of most Christian communities, including the conservative evangelicals, does not match what he said. He never talked about same-sex attraction, and the closest he might have come to anything about trans folks, I think he has one line about eunuchs, and that's it. For something that Jesus never talked about. Some Christians get obsessed with that. And so there is, and because of this sort of twisted way of understanding the processes by which one becomes gay or lesbian, the what is going on when someone discerns something other than a cisgendered gender identity. There's kind of an emotional squick factor of, like, it just creeps me out, I just can't deal with it, therefore it must be wrong.
Right.
That gets mashed up into the theological points in a way that just is not, needs to be teased apart. I think I would ask my more conservative siblings in the church to tease that apart. Now, some of them can do that. I still disagree with them, but some of them do that, to their credit. But the national discourse around that is really unacceptably messy and unscientific and lazy theology. So I just want to get that out of the way. So salvation. So several years ago, I was preaching at a church out in the suburbs, and I'm a pretty unapologetic universalist, which means that however we define salvation, everybody gets in. You know, if it's about heaven, my God is stubborn enough, like any parent would be, of saying, I'm just going to wait here until you're ready. It's up to you, but I'm just waiting. You're welcome to come to the party whenever you're ready. You know, a God who just is that committed to us, that there will be no. Now, I also believe in a God who, I would say, generally is not coercive, and so that there's some tension in that, right? So I had preached at this little church that I believed that whatever we meant by salvation, that you didn't have to believe in Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior in order to be saved, whatever that was. And most of the heads in the congregation sort of nodded because they were good liberal Episcopalians, right? But afterwards, I had one person come up to me, and she was really quite disturbed by what I had preached.
Mm.
And what she said is that if you don't have to believe in Jesus to be saved, then why be a Christian?
Mm.
And it just broke my heart. It broke my heart because I can tell you, it makes me want to cry. I love Jesus. I love him so much. And there is a way in the relationship that I've been able to have in prayer and engaging with who we find him to be in scripture and how he is present in the church that I find so life-giving.
Absolutely.
So, and I think, to be honest, the church does, even in the Episcopal Church where we tend to be fairly open about this, we still are kind of struggling with what that means. You know, what does it mean to be baptized when we say that baptism is the means by which one gets included in the church? Well, does that mean that what does it mean? And some of that I still am in process of articulating for myself.
Mm.
What I will say is I go back to the words that Jesus heard at his own baptism. In we see in the Gospels, Jesus comes to John the Baptist to be baptized. John the Baptist is like, "Why are you here? I don't think you need to be baptized." And Jesus is like, "No, we're just going to do this." And there's some mystery around that and debate about that. But Jesus goes down into the water, and when he comes up out of the water, a voice from heaven speaks to him and says, "You are my beloved child. With you I am well pleased." My understanding is that those were Jesus's marching orders. That was his mission, was that he was told, "You are my beloved child. I delight in you."
Mm-hmm.
Now, as Christians, we believe that there was something a little different about Jesus that, God rightly could delight in, but that what Jesus heard was what he understood all of us need to hear.
Mm.
And so his mission was about trying to communicate this to everybody. And it's so hard because sometimes the hardest news for us to accept is that we are loved.
Mm.
Sometimes we fight it. It's the most perverse part of human nature is the way that we fight grace.
Mm.
Someone saying, here's all the love. Here's a free lunch. Here is salvation. Again, I need to get to defining that, and we say, this is grace, it's a gift, and we're like, but wait a minute, there has to be a catch.
Mm.
Wait a minute, you can't really love me. I got to do something in exchange.
Mm-hmm.
So I think in the broadest sense, salvation is coming to terms that I am absolutely and irrevocably beloved.
Mm.
Now, part of that, getting back to the question about sin, is to say, I am that. What do I do with it?
Mm.
And facing the ways that I don't live that out, nor do I honor that in the other. But I think that most fundamentally, even when we talk about some sort of kind of blanket forgiveness of sin, original or otherwise, or whether one gets into heaven or union with God, all of those things I think could be understood in that context of, I am a beloved creature and child of God. And that cannot be taken away. And so that the process of salvation could be understood. It's not the only way, but could be understood as learning what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Receiving that as good news, acting as if that were true.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's, I mean, I've stepped pretty far away from the traditional church language for that. And I think part of that is that it is so fraught with other baggage that it would take several days of conversation to kind of unpack those. And I think in our community that in some ways is best kind of worked out in real time, in real community, with the actual questions that people bring up.
Yeah.
Because it's fine to talk about all in the abstract, but what does salvation mean in the context of someone who this is not anybody I know, I'm just making it up, you know, someone who has just come out as lesbian, has had their first relationship where they assumed monogamy, and then they cheated on their partner. And what does salvation mean there, right? Where like all of the things about gender, about sexual orientation and commitment and honoring the other and truthfulness and integrity, what does it mean there, right? So some of that we have that and then we have all of the fancy words in the church that help us get at that. Sometimes the words are helpful, sometimes they need to be unpacked, sometimes we need to find new ones. Sin is one of those. Sometimes I can use sin, sometimes I have to say screwed up, depending on the context, right? Yeah. I think I'll have to stop there. Otherwise, I'll talk for another 45 minutes. But I think that's the beginning.
Yeah.
In talking about salvation. That, and so back to your question. Actually, I do need to finish the important part of your question of what does that mean for communities who have been told, both explicitly and systemically, that there's something so inherently wrong with them, or so inherently flawed, or so inherently broken, that salvation, whatever that is not available to them. I think the work of the church is to proclaim that as a lie. I mean, that is, I mean, we need to be brave and say, your identity as a queer person, your identity as a person of color, your identity as a multiracial person, because that's a whole nother set of pieces. Your identity as well, whatever we decide, is good and valued, and who you are, and God loves you. And in that, let's help you take responsibility for your life, right? Let's help you go deep into that belovedness and look at the things that you are accountable for, right? So it's an invitation of absolute delight. Sorry, I had three things happen in my head. I got a little bit sidetracked, but there's, I think that's what we need to say first is that you being told. I literally, when I spent a year of my seminary studies in Costa Rica at a seminary down there, and had a Brazilian classmate who of African descent. And she told the story, and I mean, this would have been something that happened maybe in the 70s or 80s in Brazil, where a niece or nephew of hers, who was fairly dark skinned, was told by a Sunday school teacher that there was a kind of inherent dirtiness to her that God needed to fix. This is in the last 40 years in a Christian context.
Yeah.
It makes me, what the hell? I was going to say something else and I controlled myself. So that it is there. We like to pretend that it's not. We have to be careful about our language, right? We need to be careful. It's really tricky, but we have language of light and dark. We have language of white and dark, as in a state of color or uncleanness. We need to be really careful about that language. Super careful, especially because we're given it in the tradition, we're given it in the scriptures, in ways that made sense in their context, but we've taken it into another context and it has detrimental qualities to it. That's also true about our understandings of male and female. We need to be careful about the language there. So that's a part of the work too, is to watch for the ways that the tradition has gotten used to communicate that message, maybe unintentionally, but with real effect.
Right.
So I think that's another practical piece of the work that the church needs to do, to make sure that what we want to say, all are welcome, all are loved, that we don't undermine that message unintentionally with language that contradicts that.
Right. I feel like I'll just have one final comment, and then if you've made it this far, congratulations. You're enlightened, you are saved, like all of the above, like you've made it. But this works so well with what Angie, our pagan advisor, and I were talking about last week, the sense of not just,
I love Angie Buchanan. I love her
great.
so much.
And Angie, it's funny, when she was here, she said, I love Stacy. She mentioned Stacy as well. So
well, then I'm going to mention Angie. She and I have a great time. She is one of the people I do have done interfaith events with. It's very fun.
Right. So, which is important, like literally paganism and Christianity. I think that's very important pluralistic relationship. But again, we come back to the theme of responsibility and accountability in a deep ontological sense, right? Because it sounds like even in this context, where often people in these situations where they're so deeply oppressed are being told that they need to be responsible for that situation, that they in fact are the only people on whom responsibility should be thrust. There's this sense of kind of pan responsibility, right? Because the church, those outside of it, everyone within the system, which literally is everyone, has a responsibility to take care of their fellow man / woman / non-binary folk, and allow those situations to not happen in the first place. So it's so complicated, as we've established, but there is a sort of reverence and opportunity there to be so reflexive, as we're reaching out to these people, realize, what does this context mean? That I am reaching out to this person in the first place. What does that mean for the world that we are living in? What is the reason for why this person needs help?
Yeah. Well, and the thing that I think we white folks are having to really come to terms with is that the responsibility for repairing the damage done by white supremacy and racism, we've tended to say, well, that's a black folks problem because they're the ones who are bearing the weight of it, but the cause of it is us. And so we're the ones who need to take up that work. And I think that's another piece, perhaps, of our responsibility to make it clear that, there's a phrase that came out of the Reformation called works righteousness, that somehow that your salvation depends on what you do. And it occurs to me that when we're not careful to be clear about who needs to do the bulk of the work, we're imposing a kind of works righteousness on those who are oppressed. In the case of white supremacy and racism, you know, we're forcing, we look at salvation being not being oppressed, then we're telling Black folks, you have to, in order to earn your non-oppression, you have to do the work. Where really what needs to be happening is that white folks need to say, oh, right, we're the ones driving this. We need to do the work. So that there can be grace for those who really need it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's I think a good note to end on. I can't say enough. Thank you for your presence today. This was a wonderful conversation.
I love these conversations.
Yeah. And I feel like so many aspects of this, just by virtue of it being such a complicated conversation, I think it'll be very helpful. So yeah, thank you for being here today.
Yeah. And for I'll just say, for folks who are watching, anybody who's made it this far, I love having these conversations. If folks have questions that they just want to run by someone who will, you know, to play with things, as we've been saying often, I am happy to do that. It is one of the things that I enjoy the most about my work here. So feel free to be in touch.
Yes, please do. All right.
Or if you disagree with anything I say and you wanna hash it out, I'm happy to do that too.
Confront Stacy. All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching / listening. And thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Anna. Have a great day. Bye.